Ukraine, bringing in the harvest in what was once known as the breadbasket of Europe. With demand rising, Ukraine can again make a difference globally. Food security is at the top of policymakers' agendas, and it will stay that way. It's here that the EBRD and FAO are focusing on the private sector.
Food is produced by private companies, by private sector, by family farms, small farms, large companies. They are the ones that will produce the food that the world needs. The world is starting to worry about whether it will have enough food, and for that it is important to associate the private sector to that. So far it was mainly government discussing about food security. We felt the private sector was not enough involved and associated. There was a strong interest from the private sector to be more associated to the reflection on food security, and this is why we created in 2011 the Private Sector for Food Security initiative.
Global demand will only intensify. To match population growth, food production will need to grow 60% by 2050. The FAO says this will take more than $80 billion of investments annually. It's a big task, and it needs new thinking.
What has been very innovative about the Private Sector for Food Security initiative has been the creation of active, sometimes very lively public-private policy platforms that brought together all the players of different food chains, from government ministries, agribusiness companies, and groups of producers. So the objective of the exercise was to remove or help remove at least some obstacles to trade and investment. In other words, the idea was to improve the overall investment environment for the private sector. Clearly, the benefits of this has been to give more voice to the private sector in policy-making processes, and at the same time, I think we've helped to improve public governance in the countries where we have worked.
The initiative was developed in Ukraine, a country where politics in the grain sector has often undermined confidence in what should be one of the world's most productive countries. It's been a big success.
I'm definitely sure that it's really a successful project. First of all, to attract investments, to provide working capital for the grain market, and to create more liberal, more advanced strategy which was forecastable for traders. At the same time, it was acceptable for farmers. And third, it given us better market price as never before.
The success of the initiative went further still.
To put it plainly, the platform has helped to avoid the imposition of export quotas in the context of a lower harvest than had been expected. Export quotas, first of all, they don't work very well. They are inefficient. They are subject to corruption temptations, and they are over a very inefficient way of dealing with production shocks.
Together, the EBRD and FAO are uniquely placed for policy dialogue, given their combined track record with both the private sector and government. To help information flow in the working group, new tools were developed, such as the grain balance system. It uses official data and has now been taken up by the Ukrainian Ministry of Agricultural Policy and Food.
The government of Ukraine has been concerned with domestic food security, and it has imposed a number of grain export restrictions in the last years. Unfortunately, these resulted in substantial losses to grain farmers and market operators. These export restrictions also undermined Ukraine's credibility in the export markets. For this particular reason, we decided to create an automated system to prepare grain supply and demand balances in Ukraine. The system utilizes official information and makes data on grain production, consumption, trade, and stocks available to all market operators in a transparent and easy manner. We have also encouraged the government of Ukraine to actively participate in the work of the Agricultural Market Information System, a G20 initiative which was established to bring transparency to the global grain markets. The government of Ukraine participated for the first time in AMI's work in October 2012, and since then it has actively participated and shared information with other member countries.
It works. And a more predictable business environment is good for importing countries too. Recently, members of the Ukrainian group were introduced to Egyptian colleagues at a food security workshop in Cairo.
The ultimate objective of the event was cultivated at the end by request by the Egyptian authorities and industry to have a similar working group in Egypt to focus on the supply chain and cutting the waste, and in collaboration with the Ukrainian partners, which in our view would increase investments and would focus in improving the supply chain and of course cutting the waste, which is sizable for the country of Egypt.
These countries are importing a lot of their grain, Egypt being the largest importer of wheat in the world. They are still underinvested in the logistic side and in the management of the whole process, and as a result have been losing a lot of the grain and a lot of the food through poor logistics. Private companies are ready to invest in these countries, and working with us will be a win-win case.
The success of the initiative is hard to ignore. In 2 years, business climate improvements achieved through policy dialogue have leveraged hundreds of millions of dollars in private sector investment in the grain industry, and more than $500 million from the EBRD alone. In Ukraine, the dairy industry has now asked the FAO and the bank to facilitate a working group for their sector. More will follow in Russia and Serbia, focusing on grain, dairy and meat. As next year's fields are sown, the initiative is being deservedly welcomed across the bank's countries of operation, both old and new.